Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's damp, dusty, and downright dreadful but also oddly fascinating. Picture this, the sun has barely risen, but the streets of a medieval town are already alive with the sounds of clanging hooves, loud market sellers, and something less pleasant. The air is thick not with morning dew, but with the unmistakable scent of a place that's forgotten what clean means. You wrinkle your nose, a rat scurries by. Welcome to the Middle Ages where hygiene was more of a hopeful rumor than a daily routine. And trust me, if you lived here, you wouldn't have lasted a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you in bed already? Or just winding down? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking down a narrow, cobblestone street, your boots squishing into something that definitely isn't mud. It's hard to tell what's water, what's waste, and what's just centuries of grime. The buildings lean toward each other as if gossiping over your head, and every open window seems to breathe out another puff of musty, unwashed air. Welcome to the heart of a medieval town, where personal space is non-existent and your nose is under constant attack. A woman empties a chamber pot right out of a second-story window. Garde low. She shouts a warning in French that literally means watch out for the water, but it's not water, and it's definitely not something you'd want to be caught under. You jump back just in time, but your sleeve wasn't so lucky. This is your first lesson. Streets were not for strolling, they were open sewers. And no, that isn't just an expression. In the absence of proper plumbing, townspeople tossed waste, both human and animal, straight onto the roads. Rain helped move things along, sort of. But in summer, let's just say the stench could knock out a knight in full armor. And speaking of knights, don't let the gleaming armor fool you. Underneath those polished plates, the odor was often unbearable. Imagine being wrapped in layers of sweat-soaked padding during a battle, with no access to soap for weeks. Yes, they were chivalrous, but not exactly charming up close. You duck into a side alley, trying to escape the worst of the smell, only to discover it's worse here. A butcher's shop spills blood into the gutter. A tanner's workshop nearby releases fumes so foul they were banned from most city centers. Fun fact, tanning leather required soaking animal hides in urine. Yes, urine, collected from public urinals. Imagine being the guy whose job was to carry buckets of wee through the town square. And don't assume that peasants were the only ones swimming in filth. Castles, those grand symbols of wealth and power, weren't much better. Sure, some had garderobes, that's medieval talk for toilets, which emptied directly into the moat. Sounds convenient, right? Until you realize the moat was also filled with rotting food, dead animals, and whatever else got thrown out of the kitchens. Let's just say no one was swimming laps for fun. Here's something wild. People didn't necessarily mind the smell. In fact, the idea that body odor was offensive is fairly modern. Back then, strong smells were just a part of life. They even believed certain stenches were healthy, like the earthy scent of manure, which was thought to ward off illness, you know. Natural aromatherapy. Doctors of the day subscribed to the theory of the miasma, the belief that disease traveled through bad air. So they'd wave around sweet-smelling herbs or wear beaked masks stuffed with lavender to cleanse the air around them. Ironically, they were half right. Air quality did matter, but their methods were, well, less than effective. And yes, you're probably wondering, did they ever bathe? Well, that depends. In some parts of Europe, public bathhouses were once common. People would gather to soak, scrub, and socialize. It wasn't all cleanliness, though. These baths sometimes doubled as brothels, which led to their eventual decline because, you know, sin. By the late Middle Ages, bathing became suspiciously associated with immorality and disease. Some even believed that opening your pores through warm water made you vulnerable to illness. So many chose to stay crusty. Of course, not everyone was walking around with decade-old dirt on their skin. Wealthier folks had access to scented cloths, dry powders, and even homemade deodorants like crushed rose petals mixed with animal fat. Effective, debatable, sticky, absolutely. Here's a strange detail you probably didn't expect. Many medieval people changed their clothes more often than they bathed. Underclothes, especially linen garments, were considered the first layer of cleanliness. They absorbed sweat and grime, and when they got too gross, they were boiled and bleached. So yes, your medieval self might not shower, but at least your undershirt was getting a spa day. Some historians even argue that hygiene wasn't uniformly bad across the entire medieval period. Early medieval societies had cleaner water sources and communal washing practices. It was later, during urban crowding and religious reformations, that hygiene started circling the drain literally. But of course, scholars still debate this. Maybe it wasn't all as filthy as we imagine. Or maybe our standards are just impossibly high. So, as you step over another suspicious puddle and pull your cloak tighter around you, you start to wonder how did anyone survive this? And yet, they did. They fell in love, they wrote poetry, they farmed, and they danced in the streets, filthy streets, sure but full of life all the same. And now, as the distant sound of a church bell echoes through the fog, you walk deeper into the town, wondering what other unwashed secrets this place might be hiding. You follow the smell. You don't mean to, of course, but the breeze shifts and something pungent, sharp, and almost sweet catches in your throat. It's not just the waste in the streets this time. It's something older, deeper. You round a corner and stumble into a sight you won't forget. A man in a long apron is standing in his doorway, casually dumping a sloshing bucket of brown liquid straight onto the cobblestones. It splashes your boots. Again, you sigh. Welcome to the neighborhood. This is the reality of life in a world without toilets. And not just private bathrooms, but any formal sewage system at all. That means no flushing, no pipes, no treatment plants, just gravity, buckets, and a lot of wishful thinking. It might be hard to believe, but for most of the Middle Ages, even the most bustling towns didn't have proper drains. Instead, everything was thrown outside. Chamber pots were standard, ceramic bowls for nighttime business. In the morning, out the window it went, ideally with a shouted warning. But let's be real, people weren't always polite. So if you were unlucky, and most people were, you could be walking home with more than just bread in your basket. To cope with the mess, some towns developed makeshift solutions. Stone gutters were carved down the middle of roads to carry off rainwater and, coincidentally, everything else. These were called kennels in English towns. But in dry seasons, they became clogged, stagnant trenches. Imagine a summer day with no breeze, the gutters stewing like a soup of misery. It's no wonder that shoes were thick-soled and clothing hung long to shield the legs from splashes. Some wealthier homes did try to improve things. Manor houses and castles occasionally had garderobes, basically toilets that opened onto the outside wall, where waste would fall into a pit or directly into the moat. Elegant, right? The word garderobe literally means to guard robes, because people believed the ammonia from the waste would kill moths, so sometimes they actually hung their clothes there. Yep, medieval closet meets outhouse. And this isn't even the weird part yet. You wander past a communal stable, where horses are stomping and snorting, and notice a group of people crouch nearby, men, women, even kids. What are they doing? Well, using the same space as the horses, because for many poor laborers, stables were public restrooms, warm, discreet, and already smelly. It wasn't ideal. But in a town without privacy, sometimes the haystack was the best option. Of course, church doctrine had something to say about all this. Monasteries, those solemn places of prayer and penance, often included rudimentary sanitation. The monks built latrines that emptied into streams or pits, and they had rules about washing before meals or after certain tasks, but these were exceptions. Out in the real world, such luxury was rare. Here's a fun fact you didn't ask for. In many medieval towns, sanitation was actually regulated by law. There were officials, muck collectors, essentially tasked with maintaining cesspits and collecting waste. They were called gong farmers in England, and their job was to empty the latrines and carry the contents out of town at night. By hand, it was one of the highest paid jobs for the poor, but also one of the most reviled. No surprise there if you ever hear someone described as being at the bottom of the ladder. Remember, someone literally had to clean the bottom. Some cities were cleaner than others. Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cordoba had advanced sewer systems, and even public baths well into the early medieval period. But in most of Europe, filth was just part of the landscape. People grew up with it. Children played in it. Vendors sold food next to it. You weren't expected to be pristine just to stay alive. Still, there were moments of effort. Civic pride occasionally pushed towns to enforce street cleaning days, or fine people for dumping waste in the wrong place. Did it help? Marginally. But without the infrastructure, it was like pouring perfume into a cesspit and calling it springtime. And, speaking of perfume, you're starting to notice that the smell has layers. Beneath the sharp sting of waste, there's the greasy tang of frying fish, the soft rot of old vegetables, and the sick sweet scent of flowers someone has hung in their window in vain. Maybe to trick the nose, maybe just for hope, you duck into a small covered passageway, quiet, shady, damp. The stones beneath your feet are slick. In the corner, a child is crouched, urinating casually against the wall. No one scolds him. Why would they? It's just part of life. And that's the strange thing. You start to realize that no one here seems disgusted. Annoyed, sure. Inconvenienced, yes, but grossed out, not really. Because when everyone lives in the same grime, it doesn't stand out. It just is. Medieval people didn't have germ theory. They didn't understand bacteria or waterborne illness. They just knew that some places made them sick and others didn't. So they developed their own logic. Bad smells were dangerous. Certain winds brought disease. Evil lingered in dark, moist places. In some ways, they were trying to make sense of an invisible world with the tools they had: smell, instinct, and centuries of superstition. And historians still debate how effective their methods were. Some argue that the constant exposure actually toughened immune systems. Others say that medieval cities were death traps for infants and the elderly. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, buried under layers of muck and misunderstanding. You step out of the alley and onto a small stone bridge. Beneath it, a sluggish stream winds through the town. It's not crystal clear. In fact, it's brown with bubbles that don't bode well. But a woman is down there washing clothes anyway, slapping linen against the rocks and humming a soft, steady tune. Life goes on. You pause to watch her. The sun is setting behind the rooftops, casting long golden rays through the dust. The town begins to quiet. A candle flickers in a window. A dog barks somewhere down the lane. And through it all, the air still smells like history, raw and rank and real. But now you know, behind every cobblestone, every crooked building, every castle wall, there's a story not just of kings and knights but of waste, of water, of survival, of people doing what they could with what they had. And now, you take a deep breath, well, maybe just a shallow one, and keep walking. The night is falling, and there's still so much filth to explore. Your footsteps echo softly now as the town grows quieter. The candles in the windows flicker like tired eyes, and the streets feel less chaotic, more resigned to their dirt. You turn a corner and nearly run straight into a man wearing a finely embroidered tunic. His shoes are soft leather, his belt is gilded, and his hair, well, it's trying its best to be majestic. This is a nobleman, a man of wealth, privilege, and lice. Don't let the elegance fool you. You're about to learn the filthy truth about medieval nobility. They weren't much cleaner than the common folk. In fact, in some ways, they were worse. Why? Because when you're rich and powerful, you don't have to wash. You just make other people deal with the consequences. You follow him from a safe distance, partly out of curiosity, partly out of a very real fear of catching something, and soon find yourself inside the stone courtyard of a manor house. The guards barely glance at you. Apparently, you don't look threatening, just damp and confused. Inside, everything is dim but decorated. Tapestries, velvet cushions, a roaring fire. The air smells of wax, meat stew, and something faintly metallic. The nobleman settles into a tall-backed chair as a servant removes his boots. He stretches his legs. The sound of scratching begins almost immediately. From under a table, another servant appears with a fine-toothed comb. It's bone-handled, delicate, beautiful. and it's about to be dragged through the man's oiled hair to collect lice. That's the real evening ritual here, not skincare, not meditation, lice control. In fact, lice were so common that people rarely commented on them. Everyone had them. You, your spouse, the bishop, even the king. Combs were a daily necessity, and delousing was an act of both grooming and social bonding. Imagine inviting someone over not for Netflix, but for a casual lice-picking session. But if lice were the roommates, fleas were the party crashers. Noble homes, with their animal skin rugs and thick feather beds, were perfect breeding grounds. Add in a roaring fireplace and poor ventilation, and you've got the medieval equivalent of a five-star flea resort. You're ushered quietly through a side corridor into the Lord's private chamber. It's grand, in a cold sort of way. A heavy canopy bed looms in the corner, covered in blankets that haven't been washed in months, maybe longer. Laundry was rare in noble circles, not because they didn't care, but because washing fine fabrics was labor-intensive and risky. Soap could ruin the color. Heat could shrink the wool. Better to leave things be. And yet, paradoxically, these lords and ladies cared deeply about appearances, smell included. That's where perfume came. In buckets of it, rose water, lavender, jasmine, and civet, a musky oil extracted from the glands of a wild cat. Delightful. They didn't bathe often, but they sure knew how to cover it up. Wealthy women would carry small pomanders, tiny, ornate balls filled with herbs or scented wax to hold near their noses. Men doused their gloves in citrus oil. Guests might be offered sweet-smelling hand towels upon arrival, more for the nostrils than the fingers. And then there were the clothes, layers upon layers. Linen undergarments sometimes, followed by woolen or silk tunics, cloaks, and hoods. All of it designed to trap warmth and smell. Once dressed, a noble might remain in the same outfit for days. Changing clothes wasn't about hygiene, it was about occasion. You didn't switch tunics because it was dirty. You switched because it was Tuesday. Still, personal servants played a huge role in minimizing visible filth. They brushed the hair. They rubbed scented powders under the arms. They held scented cloths under their lord's nose during long ceremonies, or especially pungent processions, because nothing says power like a man being escorted through his own odor. But it wasn't all perfume and powder. Some nobles genuinely did try to stay clean by their standards, at least. A few rare estates had private wooden tubs hauled out and filled manually on special occasions. A noble might be scrubbed down by servants using cloths and herbal infusions. Think spa day, but less eucalyptus and more thyme and vinegar. Interestingly, many nobles believed that too much bathing was dangerous. As mentioned before, hot water opened the pores, which supposedly let disease in. Doctors even warned against washing the whole body at once. Better to just wipe the face and hands with a damp cloth and call it a day. You know, self-care medieval style. There's a book, centuries old, that recommends this charming beauty tip to freshen the breath. Boil fennel and mint in goat's milk, gargle it, and don't swallow. Seems simple until you realize goat's milk spoils fast, and refrigeration wasn't exactly a thing. And here's a detail that might ruin your sleep, but not too much. I hope nobles often kept chamber pots in their rooms, and didn't always empty them immediately, sometimes for days. The smell, ignored. Or maybe they just got used to it. Either way, it was considered normal. Comfort, apparently, has a flexible definition. Historians continue to argue over just how unhygienic the medieval elite were. Some suggest they were cleaner than we think, just differently clean. Others insist that behind the silk and satin was a very fragrant reality. The truth, probably somewhere in between. After all, how clean can you be when your castle moat doubles as your toilet? You take one last look around the nobleman's room. He's now fast asleep, snoring softly. Lice comb still on the bedside table. A dog curls up at the foot of the bed, fleas and all. The candle gutters in the corner, and you quietly slip out, back into the hallway, back toward the murmur of servants, back toward a world where class divides didn't mean freedom from filth, just different ways of managing it. You descend a narrow stone stairwell, the torchlight flickering along the damp walls, and you can't help but think, in some ways, It's not that different from today. We still spend fortunes covering smells, avoiding dirt, and inventing ways to pretend we're cleaner than we are. Only now, thankfully, we have plumbing. You move through the quiet streets now with a strange sort of confidence, like you've earned your grime, like every bit of dirt on your boots is a badge of historical understanding. But tonight's tour isn't done. There's still one very tangled and very greasy topic we haven't touched yet. Hair. Specifically, medieval hair, and hats, and how the two work together in a long, sweaty alliance of practicality, vanity, and let's be honest, odor control. You find yourself drawn toward the glow of a weaving shop. The looms are still now, the workers long gone, but a few hats hang in the window, tall, wide-brimmed felt hats, pointy woolen caps, and even a circlet of twisted linen meant to keep hair off the neck. You reach out and run a finger along the brim of one. It's stiff with age and something else wax, maybe, or decades of scalp. Because here's the thing, most people wore hats nearly all the time, indoors, outdoors, sleeping, praying, traveling, you name it. Hats weren't just fashion, they were part of the hygiene routine, or, perhaps more accurately, the hygiene illusion. You peek through the shop's open side door and spot a small stool, a half-empty bowl of oil, and a comb lying nearby. Someone's been doing their evening hair prep. You recognize the smell now: rosemary and goose fat, stirred into a paste, a classic medieval hair treatment used for shine, scalp care, and sometimes just for the hope of deterring lice. Spoiler, it didn't work. Let's break it down. For both men and women, hair was a symbol of status, of health, even of morality. A woman's long, well-kept hair was seen as beautiful, even holy. But letting it hang loose in public, scandalous. Covered hair was modest hair. That's why married women often wore wimples, veils, or headdresses. You didn't flaunt your clean hair. You kept it hidden and let people assume. And those who couldn't hide their hygiene, they got creative. Dry combing was the most common daily ritual. You'd sit by the hearth, heat a comb, bone or wood, usually, and slowly drag it through your scalp to loosen flakes and dislodge lice. People often combed their hair over a white cloth, not to admire their locks, but to count the bodies. If you were lucky, you only saw one or two wriggling shapes. If you were unlucky, well, let's not dwell. Men weren't exempt. A nobleman's flowing locks or a merchant's neat beard were marks of dignity. But grooming took time and tools. Beard oils, mustache waxes, and scented balms made from crushed herbs were part of a medieval gentleman's kit. If you think modern hipsters invented beard care, think again. Still, water rarely touched the scalp. Shampoo, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, people used egg yolk, vinegar rinses, or ash mixed with water. Some rubbed fuller's earth, a kind of clay, into the hair, then brushed it out once dry to remove grease. Imagine dry shampoo, but earthier. Literally. You wander further, stopping outside a home where an elderly woman sits in the doorway, gently combing her granddaughter's hair by candlelight. Her fingers are deft, practiced. She parts the hair with a carved stick and dabs something onto the child's scalp, probably vinegar, maybe garlic juice. Old remedies for lice. Some even swore by crushed mint leaves or brace yourself boiled onion water. As the woman hums softly, you watch her tuck the child's hair beneath a linen coif. It's simple, but effective. Keeps the hair neat, keeps the lice in, too. But that's tomorrow's problem. You move on. And now, you start noticing hats everywhere. A felt cap hanging from a fence post. A straw hat abandoned beside a market stall. A velvet chaperone hanging from a noble's bedpost. Hats weren't just protection from the sun or cold, they were a social signal. Like your hairstyle. Today, your hat said who you were. A wide hood might mean a monk. A beaded veil meant you were married. A feathered cap, you were probably trying to hard. And underneath all of it was hair. Hair that hadn't seen water in weeks. Hair that was perfumed, powdered, and pinned but rarely rinsed. Even in the church, hair was regulated. Monks had their heads shaved into the classic tonsure, bald circle, surrounded by hair like a halo of humility. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about obedience. But it also had the side effect of limiting lice infestations to one ring instead of the whole head. A win-win, perhaps. Historians still puzzle over just how often people actually washed their hair. Some sources suggest weekly, others say seasonally. Maybe it depended on your status, your gender, or your tolerance for smelling like boiled herbs and poultry fat. But here's a surprise. Some medieval doctors believed dirty hair was healthier. They claimed too much washing caused headaches or weakened the brain. Better to let the natural oils coat the scalp. Medieval science brought to you by itchy foreheads everywhere. And yet, despite all this, people cared. They styled, they braided, they adorned their hair with ribbons, beads, and pins. They painted it with henna. They plucked their hairlines to achieve fashionable high foreheads. Hygiene may have been questionable, but vanity, oh, vanity was alive and well. So you walk on, your feet silent against the cobblestones, and you wonder if someone from the future visited your bathroom shelf. Your bottles, your sprays, your gadgets, would they think you're filthy for needing so much? After all, to a medieval mind, you might seem overly obsessed. Why wash hair so often? Why remove all the body's oils? Isn't that unnatural? Maybe, just maybe, we're all a little bit weird when it comes to hygiene. We just do it in different styles and with fewer lies. A breeze stirs your cloak. A bell rings in the distance. Somewhere, someone sneezes, and you, gently adjusting your imaginary hat, continue walking. The warmth of the monastery fades behind you as you return to the town's winding arteries, narrow alleys, uneven cobbles, and the occasional puddle you'd rather not step in. Your boots are beginning to soak through. You've stopped wondering what's in the water. Ahead, the market square is quieter now, almost peaceful. You pause near a butcher's stall, empty, but still fragrant, not in the good way. A slab of something unidentifiable hangs from a hook, stiff with age, and beneath the counter, flies. Always the flies. Tonight, you've reached one of the more charming corners of the medieval hygiene puzzle: public spaces and professions. The kind of jobs where cleanliness wasn't optional but still somehow avoided. You skirt around a half-collapsed barrel and spot a man squatting by the roadside, cleaning something with what looks like a rag. But it's not a rag, it's a woolen glove. And what he's cleaning is teeth. You've stumbled upon a barber-surgeon. Now, don't let the name fool you. These guys were part barber, part bloodletter, part dentist, part amateur therapist, and occasionally part gravedigger. They did a little of everything, and most of it without washing their hands. You watch as he leans in, presses a knee against a young man's shoulder, and yanks. There's a sickening pop, a yell, and then applause from a nearby drunk. The tooth blackened and cracked is triumphantly tossed into a tin bowl. No gloves, no antiseptic, just a pair of rusty iron tongs and a strong stomach. You'd think a profession involving that much blood and breath would demand some serious hygiene protocols. But no. The barber wipes his hands on his apron, rinses the tongs in a bowl of vaguely red water, and gestures for the next patient. If you're wondering where toothbrushes fit into all this, they didn't. Not really. The medieval world had tooth cleaning customs. Sure, but no brushes like we know them. People used chew sticks, rubbed their teeth with cloth, or even used crushed salt and charcoal. A few wealthy folks had brushes imported from the East, made of horsehair or hog bristle, but those were rare and mostly decorative. Instead, many swore by herbal powders. Think crushed sage, mint, or even burned rosemary. Some used vinegar rinses. Others chewed fennel seeds after meals to freshen their breath. One recipe suggested a paste made from honey and ground oyster shells. Tasty. But again, this was mostly about presentation. No one was flossing. No one was scraping plaque. And absolutely no one was checking for cavities unless they screamed. You cross the square and spot a woman dumping out a bucket into a gutter. The contents splash into the street, swirl briefly round your foot, and continue toward a nearby stream. The smell is impressive. She shrugs at you. Better than yesterday, she says, and disappears inside. This, of course, is the medieval sewer system, also known as gravity. Waste flowed downhill, sometimes through purpose-built trenches, sometimes just between houses. Some towns had cesspits. Others relied on privies over running water. But for most, disposal meant dumping things wherever they'd flow away fast to stand praying it rains soon. And then there were the gong farmers. Yes, that was their actual job title. You'd think it's a joke, but no, these were the brave souls who climbed into pits full of human waste, scooped it out by hand, and hauled it outside the town walls, usually at night, to spare the public and their own pride. They were paid well, relatively speaking, but they weren't exactly invited to dinner parties. The smell, legendary. The risk, massive. Many died from the fumes or infections. Others went blind. Some towns even had laws restricting how close they could live to the city center. And yet, without them, everything would collapse into filth literally. You pass another shop, a baker's. Inside, the hearth still glows faintly, and the scent of bread lingers under layers of smoke and sweat. Bakers were required to scrub their floors sometimes daily, but not because of sanitation. Because rats loved flour. Food preparation had its own hygiene logic, not necessarily based on germs which no one understood, but on visible dirt, foul, smells, and tradition. Butchers washed their knives only when they looked rusty. Fishmongers threw salt over their counters. Cooks wiped their hands on their aprons and called it good. Was it enough? Sometimes. Sometimes not. One infamous case in a medieval city involved bread made with water from a polluted well, resulting in dozens falling ill. Another story tells of a town banning the sale of fish in warm weather because no one could guarantee freshness, and the stench was unbearable. Still, people adapted. Markets had rules barely enforced, but still rules. Food had to be weighed fairly. Rotten produce was supposed to be removed. Bakers caught cheating on loaf size could be tied to a cart and paraded through town, their bread hanging from their necks. Cleanliness wasn't science, it was shame. And speaking of shame, a beggar shuffles past you now, coughing into his sleeve. His clothes are tattered, his hands black with grime. But as he passes a priest on the steps of a nearby church, he bows, and the priest blesses him, fingers brushing his head. No disgust, no distance. Because in this world, dirt didn't always mean disgrace. Sometimes it meant suffering. And suffering, too many, meant closeness to the divine. Historians argue about how health and poverty were understood in the Middle Ages. Some say filth was seen as punishment for sin. Others argue that the poor were pitied, not scorned. The truth, likely both. People feared illness, but they also respected those who endured it. You take one last look at the square. The butcher's hook, the barber's bowl, the baker's soot-streaked oven, all part of a system, chaotic and crude, but somehow functional. And you keep walking, ears full of whispers, nostrils full of history, and just enough skepticism to make you grateful for modern soap.